Everyone calls Darth Vader the most iconic villain of all time. But here is what that actually looked like. 20 years floating in a Bacta tank, living on the lava planet that burned off his limbs, sealed inside a walking life support coffin, grieving a wife he believed he'd killed, and he didn't even know she'd had twins. That's a prison sentence. 20 years of it. From 19 BBY to 0 BBY, the exact span between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, Darth Vader endured what may be the most psychologically devastating 2 decades in the history of cinematic fiction. And almost none of it has ever been filmed. Disney has owned this story since 2012. They have the IP rights, the production infrastructure, the most recognizable villain in cinema history, and a fan base that has been demanding this specific content in comment sections and forums for over a decade with documented, measurable hunger. They keep making something else. The audience figured it out without them. His black armor, mechanical breathing, and physical magnitude fill a doorframe the way a natural disaster fills a horizon, a presence that registers as threat before a single word is spoken. George Lucas designed that respirator cadence to be immediately legible as operationalized evil. Even people who haven't watched a single frame of Star Wars recognize the profile and understand what it signals. That level of cultural saturation was built on roughly 3.5 hours of screen time across 2 films before 1983. Almost all of it was careful management of concealment, what might lie underneath the armor, doing its deliberate work in the dark. The concealment had an origin. Mustafar, a volcanic planet in the Outer Rim, atmospherically hostile at every altitude available to biological life. The duel between Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi ended when Anakin miscalculated a jump, and Obi-Wan's blade passed through the remaining organic arm and both legs in a single arc. He landed on a black volcanic slope, close enough to a lava river that the heat ignited his clothing within seconds. The air above the flows, thick with volcanic gases and particulates, his body could no longer process. He burned long enough to hear Obi-Wan's voice from the bank above. "You were the chosen one. It was said you would destroy the Sith, not join them." Then Obi-Wan left, because the man burning on the slope had made choices that put him beyond what Obi-Wan understood how to help, and remaining longer wouldn't have changed the physics. Palpatine's recovery team arrived and transported what remained to an operating theater on Coruscant. The suit went on in stages: chest plate, shoulder assembly, gauntlets, helmet sealing with the finality of a lid on something not expected to be reopened. The breathing apparatus engaged, and the first mechanical exhalation moved through the new system. That rhythmic, processed cadence that would become one of the most recognizable sounds in the history of recorded media. And in that same clinical room, before the machinery had time to become ordinary, Palpatine said, "It seems in your anger, you killed her." Anakin had crossed to the dark side for one reason: Padme. Palpatine had offered, with the confidence of someone making a demonstrable technical claim, that the dark side possessed knowledge capable of preventing her death. Anakin had surrendered his order, his teacher, his name, and his self-concept in exchange for access to that knowledge. The first information the newly assembled Darth Vader received was that the act of surrender, the crossing itself, had been the instrument of the loss. The suit restraints cracked under a force surge the newly assembled form generated without apparent intention. Equipment in the operating theater shattered from across the room. What Palpatine knew and said nothing about: Padme had died of no surgical cause any medical droid could identify. A will to live that had simply withdrawn from the body maintaining it. Before the withdrawal completed, she delivered 2 children. A son first, then a daughter. Luke. Leia. Palpatine oversaw the dispersal personally. Luke placed on Tatooine with Owen and Beru Lars. Leia adopted by Bail Organa on Alderaan. Then walked back into the operating theater and reported only the death. The foundation of the prison was poured in one deliberate silence. No elaborate false architecture needed. just 2 children withheld, and Vader's own guilt pressed into the space where the knowledge should have been. Left there for 20 years to do exactly what guilt does when it has no accurate information to test itself against. Here is what was underneath the armor. A man whose lungs were scorched by volcanic gases on Mustafar, to the point where breathing required permanent, total mechanical replacement for the remainder of his biological life. The suit's breathing apparatus wasn't supplementing lungs that still functioned at reduced capacity. It was doing the job of tissue that no longer existed as viable biological structure. Remove the helmet in an uncontrolled atmospheric environment, and the physiological countdown to death began immediately, measured in minutes, with no secondary system available to extend it. The coffin metaphor that fans deploy casually in comment sections is technically accurate, a precise description of the engineering he wore every single hour of every single day for 20 years. The burns from Mustafar hadn't healed cleanly because healing was no longer an available outcome. Internal suit systems maintained Vader's biology the way a long-term care facility manages a patient who has crossed the threshold beyond which recovery is no longer the operative concept, sustaining function where restoration had become medically impossible. The skin that remained was scar tissue, maintained at minimum biological viability to keep the neural connections working that let the suit's mechanical components respond to intent. The chest plate and shoulder assembly together weighed more than most humans carry as their entire body. Every sensory input was processed continuously by the helmet, running environmental scans and enhancing sound and light frequencies beyond human baseline capability, translating every dimension of his experience through machinery at every waking and sleeping moment with no pause in operation. He could register sounds that unaugmented humans couldn't detect. Combat processing ran at speeds that made him something qualitatively different from a human fighter, the inevitability of a phenomenon rather than the decisions of an individual. The exchange rate for those enhancements was absolute and permanent. Temperature against skin, unmediated wind, the full tactile vocabulary of simply existing in a body without mechanical intermediary. All of it replaced by processed proprioception and continuous environmental data feeds running without interruption. 20 years of that, every hour, with a suit that had no off switch and no rest mode, because stopping for any reason meant the biology inside stopped along with it. The meditation chamber was his only exception. A hyperbaric pod maintained aboard his Star Destroyers and within Fortress Vader on Mustafar, where atmospheric pressure and composition were controlled precisely enough to permit the helmet to come off and the voice modulator to go silent. The Charles Soule comic arc establishes these sessions as active rather than passive. Not rest periods where the suit's demands temporarily abated, but direct, unfiltered engagement with the Force in the absence of the machinery that otherwise mediated everything. That chamber was his only privacy. The only space in his entire existence where the armor came off and what remained underneath had to sit with itself, without the suit performing the identity of Darth Vader for every observer in the galaxy. For a man carrying the specific psychological contents Vader carried across those 20 years, that kind of privacy wasn't relief. Sitting alone in a pressurized pod with no available mechanism for resolution, on a planet actively hostile to biological survival, with all of it, the grief, the guilt, the knowledge of what the suit cost him, in full, unobstructed concentration. That is what the meditation chamber actually was. The one place where Anakin Skywalker could exist without the machinery that made him Darth Vader, and where the distance between those two designations had nowhere to hide. The Obi-Wan Kenobi series placed Vader on Mustafar in 2022, and spent exactly 0 screen time asking why he lived there. The suit was treated as costume rather than psychology. The daily sensory cage, the complete absence of ordinary bodily privacy, the biological dependency that makes every moment of continued existence conditional on machinery functioning correctly, reduced to production design and nothing more. They assembled every ingredient for the most devastating character study in the IP, and produced a chase thriller with a recognizable villain in the center of it. The audience demand for the ruthless Rogue One Vader as a full series, documented at 173 engagement points, with near maximum friction before the Kenobi series aired, survived that series completely intact. That tells you exactly how much ground was covered. The question of whether Palpatine deliberately engineered Vader's limitations sits in honestly contested territory by Disney canon standards, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than assertion. No Disney canon source states flatly that the suit was designed to cause pain and suppress Force potential. What the relationship between Palpatine and Vader establishes across every medium that examines it with any depth is that Palpatine understood a fully capable Vader. Operating with the Force access Anakin Skywalker had once possessed in historically extraordinary quantities would present a genuine coup risk. The suit functioned as a leash with remarkable precision, regardless of whatever rationale anyone claimed for its design. Palpatine, who had constructed galactic domination through decades of patient, layered strategic calculation, never updated the specifications. Whether the pain and limitation were intentional design choices or constraints inherent to the life support problem, they served his purposes across the full duration of the Empire. Vader served the man who was also his warden. The warden never upgraded the cell. That dynamic was established in the operating theater and never revised. The deliberate silence about the twins wasn't a single act of cruelty. It was an architectural decision about what kind of prisoner Vader would be. Palpatine needed him functional, loyal through grief and guilt rather than through genuine allegiance, permanently convinced that the crossing had cost him everything it was supposed to protect. Guilt with no accurate information to interrogate doesn't process and resolve. It calcifies. Palpatine understood this. The silence was the cage door closing. Vader didn't reveal to Luke Skywalker that he was his son until the confrontation above Bespin in The Empire Strikes Back. He didn't learn Leia Organa was his daughter until the Battle of Endor in Return of the Jedi, roughly 23 years after Palpatine stood in the delivery room with full knowledge of both births. In the Marvel Darth Vader comic series written by Kieran Gillen, set in the weeks immediately following the Battle of Yavin, Vader learned Luke's surname through his own intelligence network. The pilot who destroyed the Death Star was named Skywalker. The panel in which that information lands is one of the most economical moments of psychological devastation in the comic canon. A name. 19 years of guilt colliding simultaneously with the discovery that the guilt had been constructed on a deliberate lie. He sets a personal agent to confirm what the name implies, because a man who has been told his wife died and his heir was never born can't process the discovery that both facts were manufactured in the same room on the same night. The grief had been running at full concentration with nothing adequate to process it against. The following scene isn't confirmed in the provided dossier. The dossier appears truncated and may address it in missing content. Vader travels to Naboo to visit Padmé's tomb. He stands in the room where her preserved body lies and says nothing, because there is nothing to say to a woman whose death you believed was your fault for 19 years, whose children you didn't know existed, whose last words reached you only as Palpatine's weaponized paraphrase. He leaves. The grief is still there when he exits the tomb, exactly as concentrated as when he entered. Because grief with no resolution and no accurate information simply accumulates without diminishing. The 123-like comment about Vader using the Force to write sexually charged poetry in tribute to Padmé lands because it's emotionally true rather than literally absurd. The audience recognized something official content kept declining to show. This man wasn't managing his grief. He was marinating in it, daily, for 2 decades, in a fortress with a direct view of the lava flows where she became unrecoverable. Mustafar presented a geographic contradiction that sat unanswered in comment sections for years. A man with the resources to live on any of 10,000 inhabited worlds chose to reside on the lava planet that had incinerated his limbs, scorched his lungs, and permanently closed off every future he'd been trying to protect. Soul's Fortress Vader arc provides the canonical answer. A dark side force vergence was concentrated on Mustafar. The planet's accumulated violence across centuries had soaked into the rock in a way the Force made tangible and navigable. Vader pursued a ritual there using the preserved consciousness of an ancient Sith Lord named Darth Momin, a presence trapped in a mask that communicated architectural visions, a specific structural configuration built precisely on the Vergence Point, capable in theory of opening a door through the Force into the space where the dead persist. The design Momin transmitted required exact placement on Mustafar's surface, anchored to the dark side concentration at that specific location. Vader built Fortress Vader there because the planet itself was the instrument he needed for one purpose: to find Padme Amidala on the other side of death. That canonical answer and the psychological one aren't in conflict. They reinforce each other with uncomfortable precision. The man who chose to build a castle on the exact volcanic terrain where his limbs were incinerated, where he burned long enough to hear Obi-Wan deliver a eulogy over his still-living body, where the last version of Anakin Skywalker's future died in sulfur and heat. That man wasn't separating the location's utility from its meaning. Every morning in Fortress Vader began with the same lava flows visible from the same windows. And every day he woke up and looked at the place where he made the choice that cost him everything. And the choice still hadn't delivered what he'd traded for it. He had the resources to live anywhere, and chose the one location in the galaxy that was a daily, geologically inescapable reckoning with what he'd done. The ritual was something the canon has never documented as successfully executed. He remained on Mustafar, returned to the lava views, the morning routine of a man who has no mechanism for changing the past and no intention of removing himself from its immediate visual vicinity. During those same years, Vader hunted. The Inquisitorius confirms the hunting activity without identifying the organization by name. The dossier may address this in truncated content. His squad of force-wielding hunters, spread across the galaxy in the early Empire period, to eliminate anyone capable of challenging Palpatine's consolidation of power. In 19 BBY, Vader personally killed Jedi librarian Jocasta Nu as part of his campaign against Order survivors. What that specific work required of him psychologically deserves a moment. A man trained from childhood in the Jedi Order's philosophy and discipline, who had spent his formative years in the temple on Coruscant, systematically hunting down and executing the surviving members of the community that had raised him. Jedi survivors tracked across the Outer Rim, pressed Anakin Skywalker further into an identity he'd chosen and couldn't exit. In 3 BBY, 16 years into the prison sentence, Ahsoka Tano, who had known Anakin before the suit, who called him by his name rather than his title. The ledger confirms only the duel on Malachor in 3 BBY, dueled him on Malachor. 2 years later, he was hunting down another former Jedi. 1 year after that, a new hope began. The emotional accumulation across those 16 years isn't a military record. It's a man systematically executing every remnant of his former self that the galaxy continued to produce, returning each time to Mustafar to sit without the armor and account for what he'd done. 20 years of that existence produces a specific kind of monster. That sentence is the script for the Rogue One hallway. Those 30 seconds answered a simple, creative question. What does a man who has lived through all of this look like when he operates at full capacity, with no restraint, against opponents who have no realistic mechanism for surviving the encounter? The filmmakers understood, even if obliquely, that something needed to pay off. He operated without wasted motion or theatrical performance, arriving at maximum lethality immediately. Escalation implies a starting point, and he had bypassed that concept decades earlier. Soldiers in a dark corridor with nowhere to go, separated from the information they'd sacrificed everything to obtain by a single armored door. And then the lightsaber illuminated what was behind them. 30 seconds. More genuine emotional response than most of the Disney Star Wars era combined. What made that scene work was that it didn't require explanation. The audience supplied the full architecture from everything they already understood. 20 years in the suit, 20 years on Mustafar, 20 years of compressed grief with no resolution, no accurate information, and a warden who called the pain wisdom. The tomb visit on Naboo, Ahsoka on Malachor, Jocasta Nu in 19 BBY, the failed ritual on Mustafar. The hallway was that entire history made visible in 30 seconds of corridor. Disney accidentally produced it. Let the filmmakers make the case for what Vader becomes when the material is taken seriously, and then spent subsequent years producing content that consistently declined to follow the thread. A full series built around that version of Vader is the most obvious unused asset in the history of the IP. The audience is documented, measured, vocal, and has been waiting with patience that expired years ago. Dead serious institutional demands, at 173 engagement points, sit alongside 357 like jokes about a respirator that sounds like a bong rip. Because when the story you need hasn't been made for over a decade, humor is what frustration wears when it has nowhere better to go. Both responses come from the same unmet desire, two faces of the same demand. The suit's physical horror, the failed resurrection ritual on Mustafar, the twin secret Palpatine maintained for 23 years, the tomb visit on Naboo, 16 years of hunting down Jedi as systematic self-destruction. Every word of it already exists in documented, sourced canon. The Rogue One hallway proves that when you take any portion of this material seriously, the audience responds with something that looks like recognition rather than entertainment. The specific reaction of people finally seeing something that was always true. This is all sitting right there in the lore, waiting to be filmed. Subscribe for more stories like this.